Welcome to Dancing in the World, the podcast that reveals cultural confluences and dance practices around the world. I'm Kate Spanos.
And I'm Sinclair Ogaga and Morgane.
And today we're going to talk about this idea of confluences. What do we mean by confluences? This idea of confluences, I think, really well describes the way that we've been talking about our experiences in dance, the way that it relates to, when we think of confluences, we think of water, fluidity, flow. We think about, dominant streams kind of coming through and other streams coming to meet it. Maybe those dominant streams are washing them away, or maybe they're flowing together in ways that, if we think about it in terms of culture, they mix together. There are tributaries that branch off and waters or cultures meeting. And I think that really describes the ways that we've been talking about migrating into different spaces as dancers throughout our lives.
Yeah, I mean, that just brings us the idea. I think we struggled with this whole cultures coming together, right? Defining what that was and staying with rigid categories was something that was kind of tough for us. I think feeling like we as people, we bring in our own identities and our own cultures into this space that is made for dance, right? And then you find that other people are also bringing their own cultural identities. Some are able to talk it down and be like, okay, this is just dance, but we cannot because we express culture. I express African dance and you do your dance, and we're there, we're glaring, and people can see. We found that we cannot associate with dance the way other people are thinking of it. And so we try to define ourselves as cultural people or particular dance cultures, and we find that people don't accept us. And so there is a clash.
Yeah.
But instead of thinking and staying with the idea of clashing, I think it was just perfect to think about us flowing into it and getting out of it, like water will do.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the time when we're talking about dance and identity and culture, the notion of contact zones, or the theory of contact zones by Mary Louise Pratt, has been something that a lot of people will point to. And in many ways, we've talked about how often it does feel like a clash, and it really does feel like Eric Wolf's idea of like billiard balls like colliding and hitting up against each other. But in many ways, sometimes it's not such a clashing experience. It's just a constant flowing in and out. So I think that the reason why we've kind of been attracted to this idea is because it's not always about these rigid categories or identities that don't fit together. Like, you and I, according to these ideas, should have nothing in common. And yet we do find things in common. So confluences kind of helps us conceptualize that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, during our writing, we came across intersectionality as kind of a framework. We also talked about the confluence and the billiard board using some anthropological terms, and I think we stayed with confluence, which isn't new. Like, it's not a new term in dance. We've always used confluence in dance, but for us, we could relate more with confluence as an idea. And I think maybe because we come from cultures where we think about the experiencing of dance, right? We don't think about intellectualizing it, but we should. And that is why, when after studying all these years, we find that if we do not, other people will intellectualize it for us, right? And so when you intellectualize dance, you would see how people are producing knowledge, and you begin to use those production to uplift certain type of voices. And that makes, when us as cultural people do not know that people do that about our dance, we're at the disadvantage, right? And so what we found is that after studying for these many years, we came to the realization that, oh yeah, people do this. And what we do is actually producing knowledge, but we never think about intellectualizing it. We just want to dance.
Right.
Dance is for everybody, and
It's
we
in the
dance.
body.
Right, but some people come into the space, they share the dances with us, but then they embody what we produce.
Yeah.
And then they take that with them, and we just say, oh, we're dancing, right? But I think we at some point need to understand that what we're doing, the cultural knowledge that we're producing, is kind of an intellectuality in itself. And we have to produce that and know that. And I think thinking about confluence is this way, moving in and out of these various cultural, intellectual ways, and thinking about movement generation, for me, feels more natural
Yeah.
to think of that way.
One of the biggest things that we talk about in the book and that we've talked about in our conversations is this idea that the body has intellect as well. So we're really questioning, I think, what intellectualism is.
Yes.
And you mentioned intersectionality, which we also talk about in the introduction of the book, which is such a great framework for thinking about identity and, cultural identities, racial identities, ethnicities, things like that. And we had a really great example of how kind of intersectionality and confluences are very similar, connected ideas, but also different. So remembering like the Samba Party, where
Yes.
this whole conversation really started. And if we think about it, the conversation really started as us just dancing together,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, that was a good example of confluence space, that you didn't have to think about, what was happening, right? What was the structure? It was just a pizza joint, right? We are just having fun and dancing. I think that is something that happens with cultural peoples that becomes hard to explain when we move into more intellectual spaces, which we'll talk about later. Yeah, but the idea of confluence is just stayed with me. I would kind of move us into thinking about why it may have resonated with us more, moving from Nigeria and thinking about what Nigeria is, right?
Yeah.
Nigeria is really a huge confluence country with many different cultures. And it's amazing how we've been able to live with ourselves for so long after colonization. So Nigeria is a country that during the colonizing era, we were put together from many different cultures, put together to form a country. And as such, our cultural dances were put into that mix and ball. So we had to live with each other. I think looking at Lokoja, Lokoja is a state is a city right in the middle of Nigeria where the River Benue and the River Niger meet and then flow down into the deltas and then the Atlantic Ocean, the Gulf of Guinea. But that town really embodies what we're talking about, both metaphorically and literally, the waters coming together. The town is literally called Confluence Town. But what happens in that town really fascinates me. It's like when people are traveling to the north, traveling to the south, they meet at this place where they take a break and have meals and just refresh themselves to continue the journey. But if you stand back and take a macro look of this place, you find that people really are moving with their whole cultural identities, interacting with each other, and just moving about their lives and living with each other. And you could tell that people from the south are different from people from the north. And so when I think about dance and spaces that house dance, is like we come into these spaces regardless of what we're going through as a people, and we just dance in there and experience that and then move away. And that is like, in my definition, Nigeria embodies this idea of confluence. But in our traditional dances itself, you find that we do take on attributes from nature, like water. Some dances in Nigeria embodies this idea of water. The Olokun dance, for example, is very tied to water dancing in the Delta states. The Ekombi dance in Cross River State is very water. Even the movement is like wave, water wave. And so I think me drawing this relationship with confluence and water is really natural for me.
I love the metaphor of Confluence Town. It works so perfectly because it also, I would imagine that in Confluence Town, there's people speaking different languages. You've talked about the different foods. There's the different body movements and things like that. And in many ways, we talk about dance as language. We also talk about how we don't always love the analogy of dance and language because it intellectualizes in a way that we think does a disservice to dance sometimes when we think about verbalizing ideas in that way. But I think that the anecdote about Confluence Town that you talk about in the book really kind of exemplifies what we mean about being a single individual body that experiences these migrations between different spaces and between different ideologies, right? And you told the story about, arriving in Confluence Town on your way, like, to a major transition
Right.
in your life.
Yeah, and just thinking about that, I just graduated from college, and I was moving to from high school, and I was moving to college, and just having that moment to think through this 12 hours drive and arriving at Confluence Town, looking at how joyful people are to just feel like they're relaxed. They can refresh themselves and eat, and see new people, see new places. And it was just something that resonated with me that moment, that people can be people, just, walking around, talking and introducing themselves, talking to strangers. And then I arrived at the University of Benin, where I went to college for theater arts and dance. And even there, try to find places that would house my mind. So my body moving through this transition, but my mind also had to move through it. But I found this tree where I would sit down every evening and just take my lines, and that was my confluence down where my ideas came together. So thinking about the body moving through space and the mind moving through space as well is important. But I think space kind of is important. That's what houses us. What then is confluence, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, space I think is the key connection
Yeah.
for all of this, and Confluence is a way of describing spaces. And there's so many different ways that academics and dancers have talked about space. It's obviously, for dancers, it's a body moving through space, and either individually or in community with others. And for me, I think that's one of the most interesting things to think about in terms of confluence, because I feel very comfortable dancing as an individual, as an Irish dancer, and I often do practice alone, especially in the past 10, 15 years, since I've kind of been not performing with a group as much or teaching as much. Recently got more into it. But even so, even when I'm dancing alone, because I'm doing a form that has such a strong tradition and that I've learned steps from various people and I know that they have histories, I feel like there's kind of a collapsing of space and time. I feel connected to maybe an Irish dancer from the late 1800s in North Kerry, Ireland, even though I've never, of course, met him. But there's that confluence of time
Yeah.
as well that I think is really interesting, and to feel very strong in one's own body, but also feeling part of this collective body.
Yeah. So if we try to kind of picture a confluence space, how would we describe it?
I mean, I think often when we think about confluences, we've seen these images, right, of
Yeah.
like rivers or bodies of water meeting, and one is like muddy water and one is clear, and they don't
Sometimes
flow
they
into
don't-
each
yeah.
other. Like sometimes those are the most incredible, like
Yeah.
natural photos of confluences. But the photo that we found for the cover of this podcast is so perfect because it shows the streams coming in, and there's a very clear dominant stream, which is what we talk about throughout the book and throughout this podcast of, there's one dominant mainstream that kind of like tries to take over, and all of the others are trying to maybe come in and fit in and maybe branch off, and everything changes with these different flows.
Yeah, I think just looking at the gushing power of the dominant just made me go, ooh, that is really a dominant force. But then looking at the neighborhood around this confluence space makes me just wonder how the streams divide the neighborhoods, right?
Yeah.
But the confluence is right in the center of it, which is just so powerful. And I think when we talk about confluence spaces, like physically where we dance, like the nightclubs are really in the center of the neighborhood, right? They're just there, and people move into the nightclub to interact, and they
Yeah.
move away. And if we think about academic dance, right, where is the dance studio located? Where is the dance theater? located, right, where people go see those dances. That is a confluence space where dance happen, right? Some people would think, oh, but why does that matter? Why are we problematizing that? We are problematizing it because of the gushing power of this dominant force, which could be, I mean, if we go literal, will be the funding, the people who
Yeah.
are expected to be in those spaces, the type of bodies, and this is like an old conversation about diversity, inclusion, etc., right? Race and all that can come in. But I think we think about it in kind of the most literal, granular level, just saying we go into these spaces and we dance there.
Yeah.
What happens when we're in there is
Yeah.
what this conversation is about,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
And bringing back this idea of intersectionality that we just talked about as like people having intersectional identities. There are elements to their identities that, I can say I'm white, I'm a woman, I'm American, I have Irish heritage, I have Greek heritage, all of these different elements that I feel are, and I'm a dancer, that's a really important part of my identity. And all of these things coming together to create one's intersectional identity, but the confluence is the situation or the event or the encounter that brings us together. So the two of us sitting here dancing together, figuring out how to dance together at that samba party was really a confluent experience.
Yes.
And we weren't thinking about, I wasn't thinking like, oh, I'm a white woman dancing with Sinclair, a black Nigerian man. It wasn't, that wasn't it. It was just, how are we going to work together? And it, maybe confluence doesn't always have to be so utopian and cooperative, right? But these confluences happen.
Yeah, I think recognizing that the confluences happen is why we need to know that there might be problems in there.
Yeah.
Like we need to attend to. Right? That's why we're having this conversation. But I think when we talk about identity, and we talked about intersectionality a lot and seeing why it doesn't quite fit, I think when we have danced for so long, we have picked up dance as an identity. And through that, we live through life, right? And I think we're staying with dance as an identity. I do not want to say I ignore being male, being black, or, being anything else in this world. But I'm saying that dance in itself is where my language is. When I think about my culture, I think about I want to move that way. When the music comes on, I move in a certain African way. When I have conversations and when I want people to value what I produce, I want them to value my dance, right? So dance is this strong identity that lives over everything and kind of represents everything that I am. And so when we think about that as coming into a space, we're not thinking about it as something that is so rigid that we're thinking about it as more malleable, right? So
Yeah.
we don't carry dance around saying, oh, I'm a dancer, until you dance before people will know you're a dancer. And the spaces that we find ourselves in most of the times, not everyone is a dancer, right? Not
Yeah.
everyone, some people just want to watch, but they come with perspective that shapes how we dance and participate in dance. And that matters a lot.
Yeah.
And that's why we oftentimes run into this whole, we want to dance is fun, but then we have a problem when it doesn't go all well. And like, why didn't you like it? What did we do wrong? And I mean, we can talk about how we've experienced conflict and
Yeah.
dealt with conflict within confluence spaces.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think this idea that we're supposed to fit into these rigid identities is really what we've come up against in our conversations, and feeling like, you just said you will always strongly identify as male, black, Nigerian, all of these things. I will always, of course, own my identity as well as a white American, Irish, Greek woman. But that confluence gives us a place where we feel like we can situate ourselves, because so often what we've talked about in our experiences has been that in academia, for example, we don't fit in, and we're being told we have to behave a certain way or we have to be in certain spaces because of these identities that we carry with us, which are absolutely valid. But that means that we never feel like we belong.
Correct.
And many of the stories that we tell throughout the book and that we'll tell in previous episodes, or upcoming episodes of the podcast, point to the ways that confluence kind of helps us feel like we are somewhere and not stuck in this nowhere in between place where we're never really accepted.
Yeah, I mean, you were right, and as you were talking, I just thought about this whole idea that nowadays, we carry some obvious identities, like a black man, when you interact with them, and you could see how someone can be racist to them, right? And we don't want to do that. So in society, we've come to a place where we've acknowledged some certain type of identity presentation that we could see visually and cue ourselves how to behave. Now, dance doesn't have that. Dance is so loose that racism and marginalization is so overt that people don't know how to not be racist to people that they don't understand their form. Because it's dance, I can say anything I want. I can
Right.
do anything I want. You can tell a black man, oh, that is not a dance. That dance doesn't look good. That dancer is not trained. But you can't tell a black man in real life that they have an accent and that accent is not good because you will be racist. But you feel comfortable doing that to the dance itself, right?
Yeah.
Now you're saying, oh, if I critique their dancing, I'm being objective. No, you're being racist. But because we haven't defined these parameters about how to engage with forms that we don't know, we think it's not as important, even as detrimental as it could be when you're overtly racist to someone who may be appearing black or underrepresented. That's why this conversation about confluence really hits home for me.
Yeah.
Because I've been in many situations where I've had comments like when I'm doing a waltz in a ballroom setting, and somebody will walk up to me and say, "Did you do waltz in Nigeria? Don't you know you're black?" And I go, "Well, that's racist." But they don't think that that's racist because they're talking about dance.
Right.
Yeah, and so dance gives people this sort of privilege to just be whatever they want to be to people, other people, and that sets trauma for people like us. And even though you're white, I can still see your forms that you practice that are not mainstream yet be referred to as something under. And that is aggravating
Yeah.
on many levels.
Yeah. So I think that is a really great segue into conversations about what is mainstream in our definition, what is not mainstream. So I think we'll take a quick break
Yes.
and then we'll come back and talk about mainstream and non-mainstream.
All right. So, Kate, we've been talking about this mainstream gushing stream. Like when we talk about dances that are mainstream, like what do we think of? What are those dances we're visualizing?
Yeah, for me, it's always been the world of ballet and modern dance. As somebody that I grew up doing Irish dancing, right? I went and did my master's in Irish dancing, but even being in my own space all the time, there's always this knowledge that ballet and modern dance or contemporary dance were this world of like more legitimate dance. Something that like I wasn't quite a real dancer because I couldn't do pirouettes, for example. And I think that, going into academia in a program that had mostly ballet and modern, I felt when I came back to the U.S., it just makes it really clear that, it's true. The majority of people in academia are studying or practicing ballet or modern dance, especially modern dance, I think. And so not at all to say that there's anything wrong with that. And many cultural dance scholars have talked about, the need to study ballet and modern as also dance cultures that have their own set of ideologies and values and all of that sort of thing. But still, it seems to kind of just be washed aside. Like, we don't have to ask questions about it. It's neutral in some way. And we have to define who we are because we're so culturally marked.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I think about from Nigeria, right? I'm not thinking ballet modern. I'm thinking about it like ballet modern is what Oyibo people do, like Western white people do. But I think the mainstream dance cultures in Nigeria will be the dominant cultures, the Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa cultures. But also thinking the elite dance culture, meaning those dances that have been choreographed to become kind of a national identity for Nigerian dance, like specific cultural dances like Bata dance, Koroso dance, or the Igbo Achikoro dances. Those dances kind of shows Nigeria because they have been exported more. For me, those are the mainstream dances. However, when I got to America, I started experiencing this whole idea of training and the modalities to get the body to become something through specific vocabulary. And that was when I started understanding how the fundamentals of modern dance and ballet seem to form this background of becoming a dancer that you have to train through that. Although in recent times, we in academia teaching, we have explored this idea that the body can be trained in many different ways, and we are beginning to appreciate the training of the dancer to be more expansive than just ballet modern. However, we get students who come with the idea from their studios that there is a fundamental way of training the body. And so when that is not met, they begin to have complaints, right? But I think our field is moving really fast into understanding that a strong dancer is a strong dancer. If you were doing a Russian traditional dance, if you were doing flamenco, if you were doing katak, if you were doing Irish dance, if you're not strong, you're not strong.
Right.
And if you're not strong, you're not good. And the idea that you practice every day makes you strong is true. But you have to stick with particular practices that makes you strong. And we have to understand that the body really improves with this kind of mechanical training and cultural training that happens regularly as a ritual. So we're expanding that understanding now.
Yeah. It's so important to be able to identify too that like when you started talking, you said for you the mainstream in Nigeria are these elite or, nationally recognized traditional dances. And it's really important that, to understand that we are not saying that ballet and modern are the mainstream and period, that's it. They're the ones that we're fighting against. It's that in Irish dancing, I can also say, like, competition dance is more mainstream than Sean-Nós dance in, Western Ireland. And because some are better known and there are different aesthetic values associated with each that may or may not be more aligned with kind of global mainstream aesthetic values. We talk a lot about aesthetics in the book, and we'll talk about that more in a future episode. But just recognizing that also in confluent spaces, we can be mainstream at one moment and non-mainstream at another moment.
Correct.
Like when I'm doing my competitive dance, I'm like, okay, now I'm participating in the mainstream. And then when I do another form that's lesser known, it's suddenly not as mainstream. You can go in and out, and also when you move through spaces, you might be seen as more mainstream. People might look at you and say, "Oh, you do the more mainstream version of that." So even in Brazilian frevo that I practice, if I'm doing stage frevo, it's like, oh, that's the mainstream one because that's the one people see. It's the most visible. It's aligned with the regional identity.
Correct.
So, this idea, it's not fixed, just like we aren't fixed, just like confluent spaces are not fixed.
I think that was something we hit on too, thinking that the mainstream, non-mainstream dynamics is not fixed, which kind of is the idea that ballet modern, we're against that strongly, meaning that they are fixed. But some people in ballet modern don't feel like they're mainstream because
Right.
probably their identity, their race,
Yeah.
or their gender, right, makes them not feel that mainstream, or even levels of training, right? We're in a capitalist world where we favor what is more marketable and more sellable, right?
Yeah.
And so dancers who find themselves trained in popular studios with name, legacy, become mainstream dancers because we
Yeah.
feel that, oh, they're stronger, they
Yeah.
have more to offer. And so those are people that get the grants when they write for grants because we think they are capable of doing the job. Those are people that get so much more opportunities than other people who are considered outside of those categories. So yeah, mainstream for us really is, theoretically is like not a static definition.
Yeah.
People can fall in and out of. I can be mainstream because I'm a male dancer, right? That is something that I was born with, like kind of a privilege, if you will. But doesn't mean that I'm not a black male dancer, right? That means I still come with some limitations in our settings. So yeah, I really like the idea of this movement of mainstream, not mainstream. Yeah.
And also remembering that dance itself is less mainstream than so
Art.
many other arts, and especially performing arts. It's like
Yes.
when you're thinking about funding, who gets the most funding?
Right.
I mean, this is just my experience, but dancers do not get as much
We're
funding.
already struggling as it is.
So, we don't want to cut other dancers down.
Right,
We just
right.
want to identify the way that these mainstream confluent dynamics
Yes.
play out in our everyday experiences. So in the next episode, we'll continue this conversation and talk about specifically this notion of moving in and out of the mainstream and the privileges and disadvantages that one might experience in moving in and out of them.